international audience, so for some of you, it might already be Tuesday morning. But as we get started with this event, we want to welcome all of you. We're so thrilled that you're choosing to invest this time to learn with us. And we would love to know where you're calling from so we can get a sense of our attendees tonight. There's a question panel, and we'll be using it later to accept your questions for Parker and Shelly. And so if you want to take a quick moment and find the question panel and tell us where you're calling in from. It looks like my friend Larry from Seattle is here, and a New Zealand caller, Boston, Vermont, Cleveland, Ohio, the Bronx, Winona, Minnesota, Brooklyn, a lot of US callers. Here's in Australia, so good morning to all of you in Australia. These are coming in fast and furious, but I am seeing several callers in Australia as well as many of the states around the US. So thank you so much to all of you. We are thrilled that you've joined us tonight. I forgot to mention on our earlier event that we will have some people live tweeting. And so if you're on Twitter and you'd like to share your thoughts or reflections during tonight's, whatever, this event, you can use the hashtag #TheCourageWay. Or is it just Courage Way?
Just Courage Way.
Just Courage Way. Sorry about that. Courage Way, the title of the book. And we'd love to see your thoughts later. I'll log into Twitter to check that out. The other thing we want to let you know is there will be a recording of this event, and we also have a recording from the event that we did earlier. So if you enjoy this conversation, you can go back and watch the other one. Both of them will be available for you to share with others, friends, or colleagues who might want to learn more about the Courage Way. We also want to take a quick moment, besides finding out about your geography, and thanks for those of you who shared that. We'd like to find out a little bit about you and your past experience with the Center for Courage and Renewal. So I've got a quick poll for you, and I'm going to ask you to tell us about yourself. And so perhaps this is your first exposure to Courage and Renewal, or maybe you're a facilitator for Courage and Renewal, or you've attended a program, or maybe you're a Parker Palmer fan. Now, someone on the last webinar pointed out to me that they were actually a Shelly Francis fan, and I am certainly a Shelly Francis fan, so I apologize that that's not one of the options. But we'll just give you a few more minutes to answer our poll, and I'll share those results with you in just a moment. On the earlier event, we had about 50% of the people with the first exposure to Courage and Renewal. And it's looking like tonight we have a lot more of the Courage and Renewal family in attendance. So thank you so much to all of you coming to help us celebrate the Courage Way. I'm going to go ahead and close the poll and share it with you. So it looks like we have 17% of you tonight, and this is your first exposure to Courage and Renewal. Now, if it's not your first exposure because you first were exposed through the event earlier today, why don't you go ahead and tell me that in the question panel so we can get a better sense of our attendees. Otherwise, we have 17% of you who are facilitators, 25% of you who have attended programs through the Center for Courage and Renewal, and another 42% Parker Palmer fans. So thanks to those of you who are telling me that you did attend. And we have someone who's on the call who's both a Parker Palmer fan and that this is her first Courage and Renewal event. So thanks so much for sharing that with us. All right, so as we get started.
Becky, put me down as a Shelly Francis fan, please.
We're going to count you among Shelly's fans. So I forgot to mention this at the top of the hour. One of the reasons why we're together for this exciting conversation with Shelly and Parker is that the Center for Courage and Renewal is celebrating the launch of this brand new book, The Courage Way, and it was released just last week. It's available in online retailers everywhere. So Shelly Francis wrote The Courage Way in cooperation with the Center for Courage and Renewal. And for those of you who don't know, the Center for Courage and Renewal is a nonprofit, and correct me if I'm wrong, Parker, you started the nonprofit, yes?
I started Courage work in the early 90s, and by the time we got around a few years later to establishing what became the Center for Courage and Renewal, it was really Marcy Jackson and Rick Jackson who were the first co-directors. So we sort of share the co-founding of the whole kielbasa, as we say in Wisconsin.
Well, thanks for sharing that. And the whole idea behind the Center for Courage and Renewal, which by the way is based in Seattle, Washington, is to help leaders show up more fully in the workplace and in every dimension of their lives with their identity and integrity intact. The center has over 300 trained facilitators who lead retreats and programs around the world, and a few of you are on this call tonight. So um, thanks so much. Also, just quick introduction. So Shelly Francis has been the Marketing and Communications Director at the Center for Courage and Renewal since 2012. And as I mentioned, authored this book, which tells a lot of stories from people who have participated with Courage and Renewal programs. And the common thread throughout Shelly's career has been bringing to light the best kept secrets of technology, services, resources, and ideas while bringing people together to facilitate collective impact and good work. So, Shelly, I'm so glad you're here. And Parker Palmer, since 42% of you are fans, he may not need an introduction, but as we mentioned, he's one of the founders of the Center for Courage and Renewal. He's the author of 9 books, and he's a world-renowned writer, speaker, and activist. And I think we spoke earlier, a father of 5 and a granddad to 3. And he said that most of the fans on the call are probably family members. So if you're a family member, thanks for joining tonight.
Yeah, but none of my family have read my books, so let's register that fact. So.
Oh, wow. Okay. Interesting. So, I guess since we're through that, let's go ahead and dive in. We're going to have a lively conversation, and then later in the hour, we are going to invite you to share your questions, and we'll interact based on the things that all of you would like to know. So before we started, if any of you are watching the cameras, you might have seen something really interesting. Shelly, tell us, what are the 5 ingredients of the Courage Way?
All right. Well, I interviewed about 120 people for the book, and as I did that, I was starting to see a pattern of things that showed up in every story. And so we have so many different ideas that I was trying to boil it down to just the 5 quintessentials. And what I came up with is something that you could hold in your hand or write on your hand, so to speak. The first ingredient in the Courage Way is true self. And I say put that on my index finger because it's our number one premise that inside of each of us is our core essential self, our wisdom that you may call soul or spirit or identity and integrity. And when you believe that you can access that inner core self and you believe that everybody else has access and has a true self with that kind of wisdom, then it's like saying namaste to each other. It's a way of honoring that inner wisdom in each of us. So it wouldn't be Courage and Renewal if we didn't talk about or at least acknowledge that true self exists. The second one is trust. And it's important that we trust our true self. When we have that, when we can access who we are deep down in our core, our values, and act from that place, we can become more self-aware, and not just self-aware of our egos and all of our strengths, but as well as our limits and just the whole story of our lives. The third thing that I put on my finger is community. And that's because it's important for leaders to have access to community. We can't become human without other people to help us. And I put trust in between because we need to trust in ourselves and we need to trust in each other. We're going to talk a little bit more about community in a few minutes. So those were 3 big ideas that I saw in all of the stories in the Courage Way. And then I broke it down into 2 key practices that seem to run throughout the stories as well. The first I put down as paradox. And I put paradox here on the end because it's the idea that there's the weight, the heaviness of 2 true things at the same time. The things that make us human, life and death, happiness and sadness, love and loss, things that breathing in, breathing out. The more we look at it, the more paradox is part of all of our lives. And often we think in terms of us and them, either or, and it feels like a very black and white world. But when we think about paradox, we can start to see the flow and the connection between those 2. And the fact that we can acknowledge that paradox exists helps us hold those kinds of tensions in a different way that's more life-giving. And so the other practice that is really key to the Courage Way is reflection. I put that on my thumb because as humans, our opposable thumbs also give us this ability to reflect. And as I was writing the book, I would kind of use this as my mantra. I would think on a hard day, I would call these my case study days. I would look back and I'd say, what's going on with my true self right now? What can I trust at this moment? Or what am I not trusting? Where's my community? Who are my people? And paradox, if I paid attention to paradox. And when I feel like I saw leaders doing that, and when I tried to make that my practice, what I realized is that I can hold more tension, I can hold more unknowns, and that sense of holding space for each other is another key aspect of what happens in Courage and Renewal and the Courage Way practice. And Parker, it reminds me of the stories that you tell about sometimes the clearness committee or some of our practices in the circles of trust are like holding shy souls like you would hold a small bird. And last year when I was in the midst of writing, I was sitting outside on my deck right outside my writing studio, and a small bird just went right into the window and flopped back out onto my deck and was upside down. And my partner picked up the bird really quick and set it up, right side up in my hands, and his eyes were closed, and you could see his little gyros going around. But I just held that bird for a few minutes, and I could see it had little whiskers on the side of its beak. How often do you get to see a bird up close? But I held it and just waited and watched it breathing, and pretty soon it just flew off. And I think that is a moment of trusting in life in a different way. And I think that that's a capacity that Courage Way leaders have cultivated. And so I would put, courage and integrity and authenticity in the palm of my hand, and thinking about holding that. So these are my 5 quintessentials. This is kind of one of the things that I'm thinking about in the
Shelly,
book. And so,
did you have a way to remind our attendees of how they can reflect in the same way, maybe if they don't want to draw on their hand?
Well, if you don't have a Sharpie, here's something you can try. Take a piece of paper and put your hand face up. Don't put it face down like you do at Thanksgiving, but put it face up and trace around it and put true self, trust, community, paradox, and reflection. And then you can start taking notes on that paper and reflect on some of those things in your life that may or may not be present.
And you said to put on the palm, courage, authenticity.
Courage, and courage, authenticity, and you can even draw on your lifelines and think about, it sounds kind of silly, your palm reader, but think about what has changed over time in your life.
Nice, thank you.
Just something fun.
Nice. I presume we're going to open up a tattoo parlor to get this done, right?
Or we're going to get stock in Sharpies.
Exactly. Well, so you mentioned the true self, Shelly, and I'd love us to discuss for a minute, what are the signs that you're not attending to your true self? What would be some indications that perhaps you're neglecting that part of yourself?
Well, I think when you say, gosh, I'm not feeling like myself, or I wasn't myself at that moment, there's something inside that tells you that you're either out of alignment, you're not grounded, you're not feeling like yourself. So how often does that happen? Sometimes our bodies just shout it out to us, when we're exhausted or tired, and your body is trying to give you a signal. Parker, I'm curious, we talk about in leadership, a lot of people talk about their gifts and strengths, but you have also said that it's really important to pay attention to your limits or the shadow side of true self. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I think has given our work credibility with a lot of people. I've always said we're not in the business of cheerleading for teachers, for example, to stay in the role of teacher, because the purpose of our programs is sort of to discern who you are and where you belong in the world, in the words of that old Shaker song, where it is that you come down right. And so that involves allowing reflection on your shadow side, the side of your limitations, as well as on the side of your potentials and your strengths. Joseph Campbell once said something that's always stuck with me. He said, "Never trust anything that doesn't have the dark thread in it." And, in today's world, how can you trust anything that doesn't have the dark thread in it, the shadow thread, the thread that scares us, that, is that crack in everything that can either let in the light or let in the demons, depending on how you understand it and how you hold it. So as Jung taught us, I think, the shadow has gold in it. The shadow is a befriending force, ultimately, if you learn to listen to it. A lot of us get in trouble by thinking we can do anything we want to do, and of course we can't. Everything has a nature, and to have a nature means to have limits as well as potential. So when an engineer builds a bridge, he or she is thinking about the nature of the material that they're working with. And that nature involves strengths to carry so much capacity, so much load capacity, but also a point at which it snaps and breaks and the cars fall into the river. So you have to think of on both sides of the question. It seems to me it's a hard thing to face into one's shadow, especially when it first pops up and it frightens you. But ultimately, I think getting acquainted with your shadow and realizing that the voice that's coming out of the darkness is a voice that has something to teach you, as well as the one that comes out of the light.
Mm-hmm. Wow, it's so much to think about. And I'm still thinking about some of the things we talked about earlier. And I think that what's occurring to me is something you said on the first call earlier today about how wholeness doesn't mean perfection. And so part of recognizing the shadow is realizing that you can be whole even though you have a shadow.
Yeah, thank you for reminding us of that, Becky, that this notion that wholeness doesn't mean perfection. And unfortunately, I think it gets confused a lot with perfection in our culture, sort of in Western culture, American culture. Every day in every way, I'm getting better and better. That's not my life experience. Every day in every way, I'm getting up and falling down and then getting up and falling down again. And the task always is to get up one more time. So the notion that we were exploring this morning is that wholeness does not mean perfection. Wholeness means embracing your imperfections as an important or integral part of who you are, along with your strengths. And I think we trust people, and trust is a big piece of the leadership puzzle or equation, as Shelly's stories will reveal. We trust people who acknowledge their own limitations as well as their strengths, and who are able to talk about them openly and without embarrassment. As I've said many times, the best words I've ever heard when it comes to my limitations, my pitfalls, my failures, and my fallings down are the words "welcome to the human race." That's what it means to be human. That's part of what it means to be human. And the words I want to say to other people are also welcome to the human race. We're all in this together, and let's not pretend that we're not.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Well, let's talk a little bit more about trust. Shelly, what does trust have to do with courage?
Well, it feels like everything boils down to trust, really, when we're talking about that connection between ourselves and each other. Trustworthy relationships create the conditions for people to flourish and for positive change to arise. And so if we want courage to arise in a productive way, if we trust ourselves, if we trust that idea that we can fail and still go forward, if we can risk innovation, courage is all about risk. And so Part of risk is trusting in yourself to have what it takes to recover, to be resilient, to try again, to trust in your creativity. And then just the idea of trusting in each other, it requires us to overcome some of our attitudes and our assumptions and our biases that might be getting in the way of trust. And so it takes courage to examine those aspects of ourselves. But when we do, it gives lift to the things that we're doing. I found some interesting research in as I was writing the book, that when we're looking for creativity to arise in organizations, or we're looking for courage to take place, two different kinds of courage show up. And in organizations that are very hierarchical or have toxic cultures, courage looks like speaking truth to power or overcoming difficulties, sort of pushing back against the status quo. But when you're in an organization where there's a lot of trust, where there's willingness to innovate and risking change, then the kind of courage that you get looks like raising the bar and taking on new projects and having a lot of energy around that. So where there's more trust, you'll get a kind of courage, I think, that's more life-giving and collaborative and progressive, rather than disruptive, which is, of course, often needed as well. But it's a different kind of courage that shows up, depending on the kind of trust in the room.
That's helpful. So Parker, I'm wondering if you could share with us what you do in your practice to fortify your trust in yourself, in others, and in life overall.
Well, you know, we live in a very complicated world, and we are very complicated people. And so I start there, trying to be realistic about, again, the shadow as well as the light. But one of the things that has always struck me powerfully about what it means to be human is that whatever we assume to be the case can easily become a self-fulfilling prophecy. So I've known people whose posture in life was simply, life is a jungle, and around every tree there's a big cat that wants to eat you, you know, and so I'm going to behave as if that were the case, and sure enough, there are enemies at every turn, because we create that kind of reality. I'm not saying there's not some of that out there. Of course there is. But we can amplify it or multiply it through our posture toward life. And I have found time and time again that if I extend trust and project trust and assume trust and grant trust, I tend to find myself in more trustworthy relationships and more trustworthy situations. That makes me vulnerable to those people and those moments which are not trustworthy. But that's a price I'm willing to pay. I think it's important to develop a certain kind of street smarts around that. You know, that this is not about naivete. This is about trying to create a better world by believing things that become self-fulfilling prophecies on the positive rather than the negative side. But you do have to be savvy about when it's important. As one of the poems we like to work with, the woodcarver, says, when it's important to guard your spirit against intrusion and invasion and injury. But on balance, I think, you know, trusting other people, trusting life tends to work out. There's something sort of bottom line about this. I've been thinking a lot recently about aging, and there's this whole notion of accepting aging versus trying to fight it or Botox your way out of it. There was this famous exchange between a 19th century transcendentalist named Margaret Fuller and Thomas Carlyle, the writer. Margaret Fuller said at one point, "I accept the universe." And Carlyle replied, "By God, she'd better." And there's sort of a bottom line, sort of what else can you do but accept the universe and try to be savvy about where you need to guard yourself a bit, but not to the point of paranoia, or not to the point of actually generating the distrust that you fear. And I totally agree with Shelly about the power of trust in creating work situations where good things happen, where people, for example, become more inventive. If you don't trust each other, which is the case, for example, across a lot of higher education, where I spent many years working, where the culture is very competitive and people operate in silos and lack that connective tissue that leads to trust, then you don't get much collaborative invention. So higher education kind of stays stuck in models that should have changed centuries ago, really. I mean, lectures were invented because books didn't exist. I'm just looking at the shelf behind you. We have a lot of books right now, and I don't think we need to do quite as much lecturing as we're doing. But the recreation of pedagogy in higher education has been very, very slow, turgid even, because people don't trust each other enough to take the risks of developing new practices and doing that collaboratively and helping each other bear those risks, supporting them in community.
Thanks, Parker. I think the thing that's standing out the most to me is, and maybe I'm simplifying it too much, but you said, if you want to have more trusting relationships, you have to be giving and maybe generous with the way that you offer trust to others.
I think so.
So we spoke about community earlier. I think that's on your finger, right, Shelly? Why do leaders need community?
Well, like I said it earlier, I think we need other people to help us become human. We need people to be trusted listeners, to speak honestly with us, to help hold us accountable, to support our growth. Leadership can be lonely, but life can be lonely too. And when we can go through the hard times with each other and have that sense that we're all in this together, we can have the courage to try new things and to keep going. Communities also, though, not just for the small circles of people that you love. Communities, the bigger place, as Parker says, where we're often with people that we don't want to be around with, but we're all part of the same area. So, and the same infrastructures, the same neighborhood, and we need to be able to cross those lines of difference. And that is something that I think our world is definitely calling us to do right now, more than ever. But how do we go about that? How do we first start those connections with people that we trust, so that we get braver to reach out and speak to people that we don't trust? And we do that through storytelling or story sharing, asking people to tell stories of their lives about whatever the issue is that we're talking about. Like, why did you first feel that way? Maybe if you're talking about voting for the first time. I'm just thinking about citizenship right off the bat. But Parker, one of the things that struck me in your writing was this notion that leaders need a capacity to receive community. It's not just building community, but receiving that. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, for a long time I've kind of held this question in my mind. So, what happens when a leader basically says to the people he or she is working with, "I don't need you, but you need me"? What kind of setup is that? What does that lead to? And a lot of leaders do that because they think they're supposed to have all the answers, right? But it's pretty clear to me that if the leader stands up and says, "I don't need you, but you need me," alienation instantly sets in. The leader may think I'm being helpful or I'm offering help. Actually, he or she is being insulting and is diminishing the people that they're working with. So if a leader can say, "We need each other and I need you as much as you need me," and this is just common sense, nothing good is going to happen here if we don't understand that we need each other. If a leader can do that, then I think something new starts to happen. And I'll give you the example of classroom teaching. I've been a classroom teacher or a retreat leader on many occasions in my life at almost every level of higher and adult education, continuing education. And the best classes I've ever taught are classes where I make it clear that I'm dependent on the students if anything good is going to happen here, and that they're going to get out of me what they put in to our communal situation. And I'm willing to put in a lot if they're willing to put in a lot. It's kind of like a potluck supper, right? If 100 people show up for a potluck supper and only one person brings a main dish, you're not going to have much of a potluck supper. But it's the story of the loaves and fishes, really, for me, and the way an expression of need can multiply the resources that are available. I've seen it happen in classrooms. Come on, help me out here. I know a little bit about this, but some of you know a lot about some related stuff. Let's start putting it on the table, and pretty soon we'll have a big meal to eat. It actually happens in real life. So leaders need community in part because they're supposed to be doing their jobs right. and community is a way to do your job right. Pretending that you're the expert and you're always in the driver's seat and you've got everything covered is not likely to end up doing the job right. So, it's one of those, I don't know. One of my favorite book titles is by a little-known Spanish pacifist named Lanza del Vasto. He wrote a book with the wonderful title, The Principles and Precepts of the Return to the Obvious. And I think, this world would be a lot better if we would return to the obvious. And I think this is one of those things.
We have some programs where in between the retreats, we then have monthly calls that they call peer learning calls or small leadership circles. And it gives peers a chance to gather and just support each other for an hour a month on phone calls, and to have that safe space where you can share some of your challenges that you're having at work with somebody who isn't at your workplace, where you can talk without feeling judged and just feel supported and actually hear yourself come up with your own solutions is a form of community that happens in Courage Way practices that is part reflection and part community support and can be really valuable.
Mm-hmm.
So Neil is asking, Parker, if you could repeat the title to the book that you just mentioned. I'm going to try it. Is it The Principles and Precepts of Returning to the Obvious? Did I get it?
Very
Almost.
close. Very close. The Principles and Precepts of the Return to the Obvious.
Okay.
As Del Vasto, Delvasto, Lanza Del Vasto.
Thank you so much. Let's talk for a moment about how leaders can adopt the practice of paradox. That's the one that I think you had on your pinky, Shelly.
It is. And so, paradox is everywhere. It's that breathing in and out. It's the idea of our inner life informing our outer life and our outer life informing it. A lot of people that I spoke to would talk about, they would just make this figure eight movement without even naming the Mobius strip, which we talked about earlier. But to be able to hold the tensions of what feels like opposites, but things that are true, both true at the same time. They're both realities that inform one of the other. If we don't have to necessarily pick one or the other, but there's some third way that we can see through to achieving a win-win situation, or just working with that tension until something else, another option comes up, kind of sitting with the doubt or sitting with the emotions of it. There's something about this as a practice that paradox can be emotion or it's something that we do. It's not just a concept in our heads. Parker, I've seen that you talk about paradox, I mean, you've written a whole book about the power of paradox, but why does it work so powerfully to open up our hearts?
Well, in Western culture, certainly in American academic culture, we're taught to do this either or thinking. It's either this or that. And there's so many things in life that aren't either this or that. They're both this and that. And the one that always comes quickly to mind is one of the most human things we do, which you've already mentioned, which is breathing. We breathe in and we breathe out. We breathe in and we breathe out. And so I like to think of paradoxes, if we refuse to hold them, as it would be as if I were to say, I think I'm basically a breathing out kind of guy. So that's all I'm going to do from here on out. And we know what the end of that road is. I die because I'm not doing what the body naturally does, which is to engage in this paradoxical practice of inhaling and exhaling. And you can take that to a much more serious level. One of my heroes in the world of politics, religion, and literature is Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the German pastor who was active in the resistance against Hitler and the Nazi regime. Some good history for us to know about these days. Bonhoeffer wrote a book called Life Together, in which he said, "Let the person who cannot be in community beware of being alone, and let the person who cannot be alone beware of being in community." And I've always loved that, because for me, solitude and community are a classic paradox that I believe every human being needs to hold. They're not an either or. And I see these personality surveys where some people are, I guess, all community, all about extroversion, and some people are all about solitude, all about introversion. I don't believe it. I think we need both as much as we need breathing in and breathing out. And so when we keep posing these false choices for ourselves, as if life were all either or rather than both and, I think we get in bodily trouble and we get in psychological trouble. I need other people. Was I made for community? Were we all made for community? Absolutely. We need other people for all kinds of reasons. We wouldn't be here if it weren't for other people. And we would be very stupid to not acknowledge that we wouldn't be here doing what we're doing if it weren't for a whole lot of other people to whom we owe a debt. Unfortunately, in our country these days, there's a lot of that stupidity running around and messing things up. But were we also made for solitude? Absolutely. There are all kinds of journeys in life that one can take only alone. As I've written about, I've had 3 profound experiences of clinical depression. It's a very isolating experience. And I learned something in that experience about surviving in solitude. But what I need to do when I'm in a place where I'm not listening to the false voice of depression telling me I'm worthless and all of the things that voice does to tear you down, I need to practice healthy forms of solitude. My writing is a form of solitude for me. Taking retreats at a little cabin in the woods that I rent every now and then is a form of solitude for 5 days of silence and being alone. For me, I just don't know any way to stay healthy except to hold paradoxes of that sort. And there are so many paradoxes in leadership. I won't try to name but one of them, in knowing that we're running out of time. But a leader does have to stand up sometimes and say, this is what we're going to do. The buck stops here, as it were. It would be nice to have more leaders who acknowledge that and who take responsibility for that. But on the road to that kind of decisiveness, you also need to make yourself radically vulnerable to community. And that means to people who are saying, I think you've got it wrong. I think you don't understand the impact of what you're saying or doing or being on other people. I think you're not aware of the demoralization that has set in as you've gone about being the kind of leader you're being, which is all decisive, all you've got it figured out, and none of we need each other and I need you. So there's 1,000 paradoxes that we ought to be attentive to if we want to live well and if we want to do our work well.
Thanks, Parker. So we are going to have a few minutes to take questions from attendees, and I think I forgot to tell you that you could be entering those throughout our conversation. So I want to invite you now to find the question panel. And if you have some questions for Parker or Shelly about any of the topics we've spoken about so far tonight, or any of the other topics that you may have read about in the book or know about from the Courage work, I would invite you to type those in the question panel now. And then in the meantime, we do have a bonus question. I know in the book you talk about the Touchstones, and I would love to know from each of you which of the Touchstones is most meaningful to you.
This is the bonus round.
This is the bonus question.
And I
surprise question.
You go first, Parker.
No, you, please. You wrote the book, and it's a beautiful book, and I love it. And I just treasure the fact that you did such a great job on it. So you take this one.
Alrighty. Well, there's 11 touchstones altogether, and we're not going to go over them now. We can certainly send out links to that list of touchstones, but these are the practices for creating that sense of safe space to have the meaningful conversations that help us reflect and share each other's stories without judging. And in my interviews, I came across 3 touchstones that seemed to be the stickiest that people would remember. And the first one was the idea of no fixing, no saving, no correcting. And what has shifted is, as a leader or in a relationship, to listen to somebody else without feeling like you have to fix them with it. We're so conditioned to think that we're being helpful when we give advice. But if you sit back and listen without that impetus to be thinking up what you really want that person to know, your way of listening changes. But you pair that with another touchstone called when the going gets rough, turn to wonder. And so as you're listening to somebody talk and getting confused or judgmental or wondering what the heck they're really talking about, if you give them a moment of grace by saying, I wonder what made that person think that, or I wonder what my reaction has to tell me about this conversation, then you can suspend the kind of I keep coming back to the word judgment, but you can create that space for listening to the deeper story to emerge. And then pairing that with a third touchstone of asking open, honest questions means that you have a chance for follow-up. You have a chance to dig a little bit deeper and not to have somebody come up with the answer that you want them to come up with, but truly a curiosity question. I like the phrase beneficial curiosity. How can you ask a question that helps somebody else find their own answer or find their own inner wisdom? So I couldn't pick just one touchstone, but to me, that triad of touchstones is my favorite combination. And I really try hard to remember about the follow-up question as well. As you can ask one question, but if you're still left wondering, maybe there's a follow-up question that needs to happen.
Yeah. Well, I like all of those, of course. I'm on a lifelong learning curve about all of those. I had a flashback while you were talking about the touchstone that involves no fixing, no saving, no advising, no correcting, to 1992 and the very first Circle of Trust I did, called the Courage to Teach, with 25 K through 12 teachers in the state of Michigan. And on the opening night of what was a 2-year journey through 8 retreats of 3 days each, I said, one of our key ground rules here is going to be no fixing, no saving, no advising, and correcting each other. And a teacher at the far side of the circle screamed. I swear it was a scream. Well, what in heaven's name are we going to do for the next 2 years? You've just taken away from us the only things we know how to do and like to do. And I said, well, that's the whole point. It's because those things are all dead end things and they tend to kill relationships. I think one of the worst phrases in the English language is, I know exactly how you feel. No, you don't, you know, because you're not me and my experience is not the same as you. What I need is not your advice about what you would do under these circumstances. I need you to hear me into speech and create the conditions that allow my shy soul to speak. So I love that one, and there's 1,000 things to be said about it. The one more that I would add, Shelly and Becky, is what we call the invitational touchstone in our retreats. We always say everything we invite you to do in this retreat is an invitation. I like to say this is not a share or die event. I spent the 60s in Berkeley, and I've had my fill of share or die events. And as the human potential movement, so-called, was rising up, and I felt like it was the human strangling movement. It was shutting people down by being very pretentious about what their real needs were. They just didn't know. So we've established this invitational principle, and it says if you don't want to be in a small group, or if you don't want to answer the question that we've asked, do what you're led to do. Maybe that's take a walk in the woods, maybe that's to sit with your journal, or maybe that's to go to a small group and answer a question that you want to answer, your own question, rather than the one we ask. And when you do that, know that you do it with our support, with our affirmation, with our blessing. And, you know, it stands to reason that this is one of those things that should be in the book, The Principles and Precepts of the Return to the Obvious, that when you say to people, all of this is invitational, it actually increases the rate of buy-in and participation, because now people feel like, well, I'm making this decision freely. They've said they'll support me in whatever decision I make, and we do. So they buy in more deeply than in any kind of group work I've ever experienced in my life.
That's a really helpful practice to try. Something I want to try now. So we have a ton of questions that have been coming in, and I'll start with this one from Daryl. Daryl said, why is it that so many of us, and I include myself, who see something that isn't quite right, but don't do or say anything to remedy the situation? What can we do to be more courageous?
Well, it makes me think of the combination of a paradox called chutzpah and humility. Parker writes about in Healing the Heart of Democracy, but, you know, it takes some chutzpah to speak up and to see something that needs to be changed. And sometimes maybe other people are wondering the same thing. So it takes courage to do that. So maybe the question is, what's my value that I really want to express here, you know, from my true self? Or who's the community that's relying on me to be the person to speak up? And if I trust one of those things, can I find the courage to go for it?
You know, I think it's a great question, obviously, because we've all been in that situation. And this is where I'm going to say we need to be gentle as doves and wise as serpents, to quote some book I read somewhere sometime. And I really mean that quite seriously. You know, I was a community organizer for 5 years of my life in Washington, D.C., working on issues of racial equity and justice. And one of the first things a community organizer understands is that when something is going on in a community that is against the grain morally, humanely, whether it has to do with poverty or blockbusting or negligence towards children or whatever, you don't go first to the mayor's office, which is often where the problem is coming from. You go to the grandmothers who are doing the heavy lifting in the community and weaving together whatever social fabric there is. The same grandmothers who helped bring some semblance of justice to Chile and Argentina, you know, when their children and their grandchildren became among the disappeared. And they were the ones with the courage to protest that on the streets and to witness to it, and eventually to bring some semblance of justice to the perpetrators of those crimes. So in a work situation, you don't necessarily go to the boss and say, you have a toxic personality that's messing everything up. That's probably not going to get you very far. But what you can do is find some colleagues who share your concern. Don't have gripe sessions about the person or persons who you believe are causing it, but have creative thinking sessions about what kind of counterbalancing factors you might enter into the situation. I'll give you a quick example. I did a lot of work in higher education back in the day, and I did faculty workshops. And I had this one group of faculty who said, we have toxic faculty meetings because we have toxic leadership, and our leaders keep sending signals that it's okay to say anything on the floor of the faculty, even if it's insulting or hurtful to another person. And we don't know what to do. We feel shut down, but we see the whole enterprise going downhill. And I said, well, I have a nonviolent idea for you. The next time that happens, make a pact with each other that one of you will just stand silently while this is happening. And then another will stand, and then another will stand, and then another will stand, just silently. And eventually someone's going to say, why are you people standing and not saying anything? And one of you will be delegated to say, we're standing in silent protest of the cruelty that's going on here. And we will stand every time we see it happening. We don't have a speech to make. We just want to witness to the fact that there's a better possibility than what we're doing here. And then shut your mouth and stay standing. Does that require some guts? Sure it does. But, have you signed your death warrant? Not likely. You're not likely to get fired for standing silently and explaining that you are witnessing to the better angels of your nature and your colleagues' nature. They continued to do that, and 6 months later they said to me, they reported to me, that it had made a difference in the tone and quality of their faculty meetings. Because, even jerks have their limits of wanting to be embarrassed in public.
That's a really, really powerful story and example. Thank you. Wade is wondering, what are some barriers to trust you see in our public life as a society, and what are some ways of responding to those barriers?
I missed the first part of the question.
Sure, barriers to trust that are present in our public life as a society. That's a tough one.
That's a big topic. They're everywhere, and I think it's our assumptions and our biases and our preconceived notions and lack of willingness to find out what the real story is maybe on the other side. In the book we talk about a framework for relational trust that goes into four lenses of relational trust is personal regard and professional respect and competence, not incompetence, and integrity. And if any of those four factors are missing, then trust is really hard to make. So, just think in just the thought of competent or incompetent leaders can damage our trust, or feeling like there's no respect for other people. So how much of that is true? How much of that is our assumptions? And what can we do to have conversations to start to get to know each other beyond the surface? What would you say, Parker?
Well, as you know, it's a topic of great interest to me because I wrote a book called Healing the Heart of Democracy, which seems to continue to have legs because somehow something's going on in our society that seems to that with which that language resonates. So I think the one thing we always have some control over is how we frame reality, how we frame particular situations, and how we want to enter into them and what we might do about them. And when I talk with audiences about healing the heart of democracy, here's one example that I use. I say, As I listen in on conversations about politics in this society, when we, the people, gather, family, friends, neighbors, whatever, to talk about American politics, we're always talking about those people in Washington, D.C. or in the state capitol who are screwing everything up. And my question for you is, when was the last time at home, in your neighborhood, in a community association, in a congregation, in a workplace, talking about people who aren't in the room solved any problem? I think the answer is never. And I've never heard anybody say, well, we solved a problem by talking about people who aren't in the room. Mm-hmm. So I say, what we need to be doing is we need to be talking not just about each other, but with each other. Because among us are the lines of division, which, as they multiply out among millions and millions of local communities and venues, become these big fault lines in our society. And we need to find a new way to talk with one another. And often that way is based more on storytelling about who we are and how we came to believe what we believe about politics or any other subject under the sun. More about that than about throwing our political opinions and ideologies at each other, like rocks in some sort of war. So we can change this dance, and I've seen it happen. There are projects and programs that specialize in this kind of thing. They help people learn, first of all, that they have a story worth telling. They help people learn how to tell that story. And then they gather people in groups who differ quite significantly on hot button issues, important hot button issues like abortion, and invite them not to tell each other what their positions are, but to tell their stories. And at the end of the day, when you learn what a person's position is, something new has happened. You've begun to realize that two people with essentially the same story can come to two quite different conclusions. Now, that doesn't solve the problem, but it achieves something that I think is absolutely critical, which is to remember that it's more important to be in right relationship than to be right. And I don't say that because I've tossed out the idea of being that there's a difference between right and wrong or true and false. But right, wrong, true, and false are often pretty complicated matters. And if we're not in right relationship with each other, we can't hold those questions long enough to work our way through complexity to some sort of mutual understanding and solution. So without giving up on the idea that there's a right and there's a wrong and there's a true and there's a false, it's more important to be in right relationship at this moment than it is to be right, so that we can keep the conversation going.
That's really powerful and helpful. So we are almost out of time, but there was a question I was holding for the end that I want to be able to ask. This listener is asking, what practice would you suggest to a leader who has lost trust with her team, and how could she rebuild trust, collaboration, and courage for herself to begin again? And only 2 minutes left, so.
Well, there's no quick fixes. That's the first answer, and I think rebuilding trust in yourself might be one of the first steps. Is looking at yourself and to say what happened and what was my role in it, and then starting to have those conversations about what's possible and making it safe to have those kind of conversations where you can break down the events that have happened and be able to speak openly about what it is you need to be able to move forward.
Well, I think I heard Parker say something earlier, I'm sorry for interrupting, about how people really respond to when you share your weaknesses, so being open about your mistakes.
Yeah, I would say that if it's right along those lines, Becky, I would say that if that question is coming from a leader, right, I would say, well, you've just taken the first step toward answering your own question. which is to acknowledge your awareness that you've lost trust. That's a huge step. And then to sit down with the people you work with and make that same acknowledgement. To say, look, I know that something's gone wrong here. It feels to me like a loss of trust. That was not my intention. I don't want that to happen. I know that we can't proceed on that basis. So help me understand. Help me, first of all, am I naming the situation accurately? And I'm really inviting your truth into this situation. I need your truth because we can't proceed. We can't succeed without it. And it always has to be I and we. This isn't my organization. This is our organization. But each of us plays a role in it, and my role is as designated leader. But that's an empty role, a meaningless role if I don't have your trust and your confidence. So what can we do about this? I need your truth. I'm going to listen. I'm going to act. We're going to take it a step at a time. I know there's no magic formula here. This is about rebuilding. And once, building relational trust takes time. Tearing it down can happen almost overnight. And it takes time to rebuild it again. But if this is a leader asking the question, it's a very promising situation, or so it seems to me.
Yes, and thank you to the person who asked the question. We just want to take a quick moment to let you know some ways that you can engage with the content of the Center for Courage and Renewal in a deeper way as a follow-up to today's event. So the first thing that you can do is go to Amazon and buy this new book, The Courage Way. And the second thing you can do is visit couragerenewal.org, and you can sign up for the Courage and Renewal newsletter to stay connected. You can also follow on Facebook, Twitter. We were talking on the webinar earlier about how Parker's Facebook page has poetry from time to time for those leaders who like to incorporate poetry into their work. And also we would invite you to explore the Center for Courage and Renewal's online resources, retreats, and programs to find out more. So thank you so much for investing with us this evening. And I missed at the first of the event to mention that Parker also has a new book coming in June called On the Brink of Everything. And so you can find out about that as you connect with the Center for Courage and Renewal in all the ways that we mentioned. Parker and Shelly, thanks so much for this event.
Thank you. Can we just, I know Shelly would join me in this, a special welcome to our friends from Australasia. And to let them know that I was saying just before we got on air that it's the dead of winter here in Madison, Wisconsin. It's like below zero every morning. And it's just wrong that you people are in the middle of summer and, able to wear shorts. That's a flaw in the nature of the universe. And I just hope there's something we can do about that.
Yeah, send us some sunshine. So we have some folks commenting on your kind words to Australasia, if I said that correctly. So greetings from Pendle Hill, and it's 35 degrees Celsius in Brisbane, although California is in shorts weather today too. There's a lot of love and appreciation coming from the community to you, Shelly, and to you, Parker. Thanks from Jeanette that this was an hour well spent, that she appreciates the work you're doing. Congratulations to Shelly, and thanks for making the sessions possible for everyone. Lots of thank yous. No questions, only love and admiration and gratitude for you all from Lisa. Just a gazillion kind comments. So
thanks, everyone.
We hang with good peeps. Thank you.
Yeah, I guess so. Thanks for sharing your people with me. And have a great night, everyone, and we'll look forward to more opportunities to connect with you in the future.
Thanks, Becky. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Parker. Thanks, Becky. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Peace out.